All right, we are thrilled to have our last speaker as Elle McKinney. Named one of Roots and BET's 100 most influential African Americans of 2020, Leatrice Elle McKinney, writing as Elle McKinney, is an advocate for equality and inclusion in publishing and the creator of the hashtags Publishing Paid Me and What Women of Color Writers Hear. A gamer and blurb, her works include the Nightmare Verse books, which she's going to talk about tonight, Nubia Real One through DC, Marvel's Black Widow, Bad Blood, and more. And we're going to work on the echo. I think we know which computer it's coming from. Okay, so yep, all gone. Excellent. It's perfect time to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello. First of all, I wanted to thank the Society for having me here. As an Alice in Wonderland fan, I must admit my faux pas that I did not know this existed until this year. It just never occurred to me that other people might like this story as much as I do. I thought my love for Alice in Wonderland was a little bit much, so I was told as a child. But I have been in love with Alice since I first watched the Disney movie as a kid. And then I had to go and find the books because that's what you do, right? You see the movie and you find out that there's a book and the book is always better than the movie. So you go and get the book. And I fell even deeper in love with what I like to call nonsense magic. And it's the sort of thing that allows for the Cheshire Cat to do what he does and for the Tweedles to do what they do and all the poems and everything. And you all probably know more than I do about Alice in Wonderland. So I'm not gonna go super deep into the original. I was asked to talk about how my work ties into it. And my work being the Nightmare Verse, which started as a question: what if Buffy fell down the rabbit hole instead of Alice? And by Buffy, I mean Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So what we end up getting is a 17-year-old girl in Atlanta who goes into Wonderland, which I have now made a real person, a real place, as opposed to, was it a dream? Was it an acid trip? What was it? But it's, for my work, an actual place called the Realm of Dreams. And I'm gonna start with this question in the world building and then go into all the things that I've pulled from Carroll, because I wanted to sort of write, not necessarily a retelling, but a reimagining of Alice in Wonderland. And with that question, that question was first popped into my mind way back when we found out that a live action Alice was coming, the Tim Burton one, right? That is Tim Burton, yes, the Tim Burton one. I have to think about it sometimes because I just recently found out he didn't do Nightmare Before Christmas. He's just attached to it. So I have to double check my Tim Burton facts. So I was sitting on my mother's couch watching Supernatural reruns, as one does. And they were fighting their version of vampires. They were fighting vampires and making Buffy references. And so I'm scrolling on my phone and I see they've announced an Alice in Wonderland live action. This was back when they first started doing all the live action ones. And I sort of had the same reaction a lot of people did in response to the Disney live action ones, was, nobody asked for this. Why are we doing this? I was scared, to be honest, but it was Alice in Wonderland. There's only so many things that you can do to sort of mess that up. So I was like, okay, I'll keep the faith. Carol's work is strong enough for anybody to take a crack at it. So as I'm puzzling over, who asked for this live adaptation, and I'm watching the Winchester, and I'm like, well, if this is a live action Alice in Wonderland, does that mean Alice is real? Does that mean Wonderland is real? Does that mean the Jabberwocky's real? Like, these are the things that go through my head. And I'm wondering, well, if you're in Wonderland and the Bandersnatch happens to wander up, what do? You pull out a sword. That was my immediate reaction. The Vorpal blade, or the Vorpal sword, depending on you're going by the movie or the poem. And so I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. So I wrote a fight scene. That's how it started. Most things start with fights with me, physical fights. And I kept going. I liked it. And then I wrote another fight scene. And then the Mad Hatter showed up, my version of the Mad Hatter. We'll get to him in a second. And so he's going back and forth with Alice. And then my version of Tweedledee and Tweedledum show up. They look like Spike from Buffy. This is what happens when you watch the Winchesters while thinking of all of this. And I'm like, okay, what are they all doing here? Why are all these people in Wonderland besides, the usual? This is where they live, this is where they hang out, this is what they do. It's like, well, what if she had a purpose for being like a legitimate, this is the reason you're here, as opposed to you maybe fell asleep, or you're maybe having a psychotic break, or you maybe took a little too much of whatever it is, mushrooms or something, I don't know. So a plot starts to rise. And the plot winds up being that Wonderland is this place that has existed since the first human had the first dream. It is a subconscious realm that has been manifested through the billions of lives and subconscious minds of every human being that has ever existed from the dawn of time, at least in my book. Thought is powerful enough to then become a physical thing. And if thought is powerful enough and good dreams are powerful enough, that means bad dreams are as well. And so I started to think, well, what would a darker version of Alice in Wonderland be like? What would a nightmare version of Alice in Wonderland be, as opposed to the dreamscape that we're all so used to? And this is when I thought I could get away with this. If I pull it far enough from the original, I might be able to do this. Other people have kind of done it. Has anybody heard of, and this is for anybody on Zoom as well, the video game American McGee is Alice? Yes. Of course. See, I've asked that question before, but then I had to remember where I am. Of course you've heard of that. I played that religiously as a child. Probably shouldn't have, but I did. And so I was like, I want to get my own crack at this realm of dreams, but a darker one. So I created the nightmares, which is why it's called the Nightmareverse series. And the nightmares are the beasts that my slayer, Alice, fights. And I'm gonna hop out of camera real quick, just so I can show everyone, this is my Alice. She's got daggers. She's got a leather jacket, Buffy. I'm sorry, I can't get away from it. And she goes into Wonderland in order to fight nightmares. This is all I had from that question that I asked when I found out they were making a real life adaptation. And so I start pulling on the things that I love about Alice in Wonderland, the characters, the scenery, mostly from the Disney adaptation, because I mean, that's the one that most people think of, like the general public. When you say Alice in Wonderland, they might think of the Tim Burton one now. I don't know, I haven't tested the waters on that one yet. But I wanted to show my love for this work and for a book that seemed so nonsensical, but at the same time made so much sense to me, and I'm sure to everyone here. And so I started digging a little deeper into the background of the book and the social commentary that Carroll was trying to, impart that we miss, looking back on it as somebody from, it's the 21st century now, right? Yes, I didn't lose that. Looking back on it from someone in the 21st century, we miss all the contextual things that happened, like how he was pretty much dragging the social elites of the time. Like there was no Twitter, so you did it in a book. That's how you did it. And I wanted to make social commentary as well. So in my book, we get the nightmares. Nightmares are physical manifestations of humanity's fears. The more fear you get into a place, a nightmare pops up. So at the beginning of this book, there is the unarmed shooting of a young Black girl at a football game by police. And the neighborhood around it is so riled up with fear and anger that it produces these creatures. And I wanted to talk about how fear can have a physical effect on a person and on a community. Fear can kill you. And stress from that fear can kill you. Sorry, went a little bit dark there. And so that's why they are monsters. Literal, will rip your face off with claws and teeth. But I wanted to still keep the whimsy of, that sounds weird, keep the whimsy of monsters. And so I would borrow from the poems. Creatures like the Jub Jub bird or the Bandersnatch. And those creatures wound up not being the dangerous things or the monsters that we see in the Tim Burton film, because they're very scary in the Tim Burton version. I mean, they're not scary in the poem, but in the movie, they're there and you have to deal with them. I was speaking with some of the other attendees earlier about some of the stories that we've seen. One of them being Coraline, which I kind of think fits into the Wonderland thing a little bit, and how something so visceral in a children's book might seem like it's going a little too far. But again, as I said earlier, I want to see if I can get away with it. And Alice in Wonderland seemed like the perfect bedrock to build this on. So we have the nightmares. The nightmares cross into our world. They're drawn to us because we are the source. It is our pain, it is our suffering that creates this creature in my version of Wonderland. And nightmares. Alice is what's known as a dream walker. She's somebody who is so in touch with, as a child, with the whimsy of the original Alice. There's no original Alice in Wonderland story in my book. Alice was an actual person in the book. So there's no movies, there's no books that Alice is like, oh, I know what this is. This is the Cheshire Cat. So I wanted to sort of bring, I just lost my train of thought. I am so sorry. I wanted to bring sort of that back to her physically being able to go into Wonderland as opposed to having to go as somebody who's dreaming about it. So she goes bodily into Wonderland as a dream walker. And it always starts, you can only find dream walkers when they're young. Because, I mean, let's face it, as we get older, some of that just sort of gets pounded out of us, right? Life has a way of making fairy tales seem less fantastical. I used to go look for doorways in trees and stuff as a kid. I used to go out and try and find, oh, well, maybe this wardrobe in this old house might actually lead to a magical land ruled by a lion. I wanted to capture some of that in what it meant to be chosen for this, but it's still a dangerous job because growing up is a dangerous job. And so you start with the nightmares, and now we have somebody to fight the nightmares. And then we get the people from Wonderland, because Alice is not from Wonderland. She's from Atlanta, 2020s. God, it's so weird to say that. 2020s Atlanta. And the way that the story starts is she's running away from having just learned that her father died. This is not a spoiler. They put this out when they were doing the, hey, come read this book, here's a blurb. The story starts with that. As she runs off, as she's so distraught, as she's so upset by the sudden loss of her father, they were on their way to a convention. And they were dressed in costume. And so she's in an alley in her costume that was partnered with her father, crying. And a nightmare is attracted to her. And it goes to try and kill her, but she can see them because she is a dream walker. And this came from that search for the fantastical. I've always wanted to see what Alice saw. Like the way that Carroll describes it, we get the movies, right? But that's somebody else's idea of what Carroll might have saw, right? It's Walt Disney's idea, it's Tim Burton's idea, it's however many movies and directors' ideas. So I wanted, again, to pay homage, but to move it in a different direction. If I didn't say this earlier, If anybody does have a question for me, you don't have to wait to the end. If you can just pop your hand up and it just worked. I just know that if I don't ask a question, when it pops into my head, I will forget the question. So I like to extend that to the audience. If you have a question about anything that I say, or if you need me to repeat anything that I said or go slower, please do say so. I want this to kind of be a conversation as opposed to me just talking at you all. Where was I? Alice. And so being human and being able to sort of do what I couldn't as a child, being able to connect with this actual world of Wonderland, the nightmare is drawn to her. But not just the nightmare. Enter my version of the Mad Hatter. His name is a little on the nose. It's Addison Hatta, Hatta. And he's not so much a traditional hatter as in, he doesn't have the bits and bobs for making hats on him at all. My Alice actually calls him a punk rock's Prince Charming because he's fully gothed out. And he wears this exact t-shirt when she meets him, which is why I bought this one. And he's there and he slays the monster. And it dies after taunting Alice for her fear. And he starts to leave, but then he just steps back and forth and he watches her follow him. He's like, you can see me. So the notion that somebody who they haven't, because normally Addison Hatta and others from Wonderland go seek out these children, the notion that somebody just off the street could see them was peculiar to him. So he takes Alice and he trains her how to fight monsters. She wants to do this because she just lost her father, and that grief and that fear that goes into powering Wonderland is building up inside her. When you lose a parent, my friend Tracy Dion said it best. It's like being unmade in a way. And there's nothing that helps with that. And so her solution was to go find things and beat the crap out of them, which, again, living out a fantasy of my own, getting frustrated and going and finding evil creatures to then take that frustration out on. And so we now have our main character, Alice, in her position, and I named her Alice because I wanted to. I get that question a lot. Why is she named Alice? Is it because it's Alice in Wonderland. It would be weird if it was, I don't know, Gertrude in Wonderland, Becky in Wonderland. So, nah. So this character is sort of the stand-in for anybody reading the book. She's able to physically fight off monsters that have risen from this realm of dreams in order to come and wreak havoc in the real world. And nightmares have a physical effect on the real world. I sort of mentioned it earlier where fear can harm somebody. There have been studies done that show that people who live in oppressed areas, who are scared, or who have certain stressors are medically more likely to experience certain aspects, which is why Alice's poor father passes away from a sudden heart attack. She's my way of coping, she being Alice, is my way of coping with the real world while being connected to the original story, which saved me. Brief aside, they will talk to you, they're not to you, but they talk about it a lot, my parents. I grew up when the war on drugs was in its heights and the crack epidemic was sweeping through Black communities. And it was rough. So I was always looking for a way to escape, and Carroll provided that for me. I, in turn, wanted to give that to another generation. And that story, Carroll's story, is great. It's one of my favorites, but I needed Alice with a little more grit. I needed to know that she could survive the things that I thought were going to take me out as a kid. I needed to be able to follow somebody through this world that I loved, who could fight not only the battles in that world, but the battles in this world. And so here we meet Alice and the bridge to Wonderland, which is Addison Hatta. And now I'll go into world building. And again, if anybody has any questions about anything, because I'm just talking about my connection to Alice in Wonderland and the books, of course. So I've talked about how we have nightmares and how they exist, and how we have dream walkers and how they exist because humanity and our kind of messed up collective subconscious, if I'm going to be honest. So then the story begins. And we get introduced to, I'm not going to tell it, and you know, you want to go out and read yourself, encourage that, just book and go get it. It's an audio book as well. The audio, she did a great job. If, you know, audiobooks, I still consider reading personally. I prefer physical books, but you can grab an audiobook. So we have our main players, right? The nightmares, taking a step back, when they get to our world, there's a line, and I'm glad I actually grabbed this because I can read that line without staring at my computer. I can be back here. Okay. So the nightmares pretty much, once they cross into our world, they don't necessarily attack humans in a way that, you know, the Winchesters would deal with. Sometimes, but not very often. But they influence the way that people think, they influence their actions. So one thing that Alice talks about is how when you see a nightmare, people hear about nightmares. Like you hear somebody who, trigger warning, violence. You'll hear on the news about some lone wolf gunman who his entire family is like, never would have thought about that. Never would have seen that coming from him, influenced by a nightmare. Or randomly, some guy will just up and kill his entire family and then himself, leaving a neighborhood broken and an extended family broken. Nightmare. Or maybe when a lot of ugly and a lot of bad gets brought together in one place, you get big influences in the world, like the development of the KKK. It's not all nightmares, but in my book, sometimes it's nice to be able to give a face to the evils that we have to deal with. So that's the point and the purpose that the nightmares serve. Where Alice's book was able to provide an escape, this one, conversely, sort of puts it all right there and then gives the character a chance to defeat it, as opposed to ignoring its existence. Not saying that's what the original book does, just saying that's what I'm trying to do with this book. So those are the nightmares. Now, Wonderland is all around us in this book. It's kind of like it's all around us here. I have yet to come across anybody who I've ever met who doesn't know what Alice in Wonderland is, even if they've never seen the book. I almost said seen the book, even if they've never seen the movies or read the book. But she's just one of those things she's in the zeitgeist, right? So the world of Wonderland is physically everywhere in my book, but you can only get there by crossing what I call the veil. Very creative. There are so many veils in so many science fiction and fantasy books. But in order to do that, you have to go to the Looking Glass Pub, which is this downtown Atlanta sort of dive bar, owned and operated by Addison Hatta. In the Looking Glass Pub, there's memorabilia all over the walls from different points in time. Some pictures of this person who looks like it could be Hatta, but nah, it's from 100 years ago. It couldn't possibly be, right? And on the wall hangs a purple cat. His tail ticks back and forth. Surprise, surprise, what that might be. So in the pub is sort of where I like to think if Wonderland rubbed up against the actual world, what that would look like. And again, I'm trying to convey something that's from like 5 years ago. So I'm a little hazy on the details. But I wanted to sort of represent this place that people sort of kind of look down on. It's a place of vice and whatnot, similar to the commentary that Carroll was giving. But it's literally a place where you can go, and in a back broom closet, because broom closets are unassuming, the broom closet is how you get to Wonderland. There's an armory, there's an infirmary, and there's a broom closet where you go in, you click off the lights, and then you fall through the floor at like 100 miles an hour. It makes Alice motion sick. In setting it in this pub, because I'm trying to do all this without telling the story itself, I wanted to kind of pay homage to the poem, not the walrus. You're gonna have to help me out here. It's not the walrus one. It's not the bumblebee. There is a poem, one of them, that when I read it, it reminded me of that time when I was dealing with my family being in the throes and my parents being in the throes of crack addiction. And it gave me hope in a weird way. Because by the end of the poem, you're sort of left with this feeling of the world is bigger than this right here, than what you're going through right here. And if you just give it time, you'll be able to branch out to that. I feel like such as Alice in Wonderland slacker, that it's jumping out of my brain. But I've never done a keynote speech before, so I'm a little bit nervous. So my brain is chucking things out left and right. Bear with me. I'll remember it 10 minutes from now and come back and say it randomly and confuse you all. I'm trying to be mindful of time for questions. And so the pub is one of 4 gateways. And this is how our world brushes up against Wonderland. There's the Northern Gateway, which is in St. Petersburg, the Western Gateway, which is in Atlanta, the Eastern Gateway, which is in Tokyo, and the Southern Gateway, which is in Cape Town, South Africa. And Addison Hatta is the guardian of the main gateway, and he's guardian of the Western Gateway. And we get the other characters. The guardian of the Northern Gateway is the Duchess, but she's not the Duchess from the book. She's given the title the Duchess because she's an assassin. And she had a royal title at court. So she kept her royal title at court in Wonderland. I kept the queens and so forth from Wonderland. And when she's off doing her assassin thing, that's what they call her, the Duchess. She's also a gateway. She also trains my version of the Tweedles, who are Dmitri and Demarcus Tweedlanov. They are human. They're from Russia, and they are Alice's partners in killing nightmares. These are the ones that look like Spike that I mentioned earlier, the Buffy references. The Eastern Gateway is looked over by Romy, who is my version of the caterpillar. She's a bookstore owner. She wanders around with this device that turns from a vape pen into a corncob pipe, into a regular pipe, into a hookah sometimes, into just all sorts of things. The Southern Gateway, I can't talk about the Southern Gateway because that's in book 3. Sorry. And so this world that I built as an homage to Alice in Wonderland is very, very different. But I tried to drop breadcrumbs of the original, just enough that people who read the book aren't disappointed that it's not an exact remake. Because I mean, there's nothing like going into, oh, this is a Cinderella retelling. Where's the glass slipper? There is no glass, okay. Is there a, there's no ball, okay. What about the, fairy god, but there's no fairy, okay. Like, there's certain aspects of a story that you look for in retellings. And I didn't want to disappoint any other fellow Alice in Wonderland friends. So that's why we have the reimagining. And my own childhood trauma of wanting to have been able to fight the monsters that we create ourselves, monsters that cannot be vanquished. You cannot vanquish fear. It does not exist in a place where you can literally walk up and stab it. She can. And I'm hoping that this series, dark as it is well received by people who know the original enough to be able to pick out the kernels and follow the trail that I've left without it having to be the full-on story. How am I doing on time? Okay. Any questions, anything that I can dive in? Is there anything that anybody wants me to dive in that they've heard so far? Because I mean, I have kind of a thing that I can go by, but as you can probably tell, if I go off on a tangent, it takes me a second to come back. But just brief pause, anything anybody wants me to explain further. And that also includes, I don't know where the camera is, so I can't look at you people on Zoom, but if you have anything that you want to ask, please feel free. Or that you want me to go into as much as I can without spoilers. Yes. Sorry, I just started the question thing early, I guess.
I mean, you're saying it's an homage to Alice in Wonderland, but you're also saying it's a reimagining. And something that really strikes me just from the beginning of you talking is that there is a sense of, you know, she goes 100 miles per hour down the hole into this subconscious collective, but there's also things that come out of it.
Yes.
And that's different in Alice in Wonderland. She goes down, but then when she comes back up, at least in my memory, I might be forgetting details. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think through how that translates into a modern reimagining where it's a two-way street, or more explicitly a two-way street.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you more about that reimagining or the choice there, like maybe expounding more on that.
So this comes from me wanting the Wonderland to be an actual real place as opposed to a dream. Because calling her a dream walker and saying that she goes and she fights physical manifestations of humanity's fears, all of this can still allude to maybe this is real, maybe it's not. And I also wanted to sort of touch on how, and because none of the nightmares look the same. Like once one is dead, it's gone. The other ones arise. They might hearken to one that existed at one point, but they're never the same. Because what people are afraid of is never the same. And how much I'm probably not saying that correctly, how much they're afraid of something can vary. We talked about this earlier. Some people find the movie Coraline terrifying. I thought it was funny. I then showed it to my younger nieces and nephews. Got cussed out a little bit, but they loved it. And for me, for this Alice, it was also a way to distinguish it from the other book, just to sort of let people know, hey, this isn't a retelling. Because my publisher for a very long time was adamant, retelling. I'm like, y'all gonna piss people off. It's not. And it did. People were upset, and rightfully so, if they were told one. But the idea of something coming out as opposed to something going in, I want it to be sort of this commentary on you get back what you put into it. And that goes for, it's for not just emotions or, the vibe or whatever, but physically, if you put hate into the world, if you put bigotry into the world, if you put these things into the world, because that's the source of the nightmares. Yes, it's fear in general, but I made the killing of the Black girl at the beginning that caused 2 nightmares to pop up for the first time. As long as Had has known, nightmares have been around. That was the first time 2 popped up at once. So I wanted to say, without being, over the top or, preachy or in your face about it, that the ugliness that gets put out into the world for no reason whatsoever literally comes back and tries to kill people. Just to share some of what it is to deal with some of that stuff. I mean, being a Black queer woman, there are just things in my life and in the lives of others in my community that a lot of people in the world don't know about for whatever reason. So I wanted to sort of share what that was like, to have this fear of something out in the world ready to just come through and eat you, come through and destroy you and everything you love because somebody else put something ugly out into the world. And I hope that that makes sense. Putting the words on the page is a lot easier than talking them. Was there anything else? How soon do I have to stop for like the actual question section? Or I could keep just randomly. I could talk about the characters for hours. Trying not to talk about the plot while talking about the characters is proving mildly difficult.
That would be a lot trickier. You've got probably about 15 more minutes to talk, and then we'll do the Q&A.
Cool. Okay. Tweedles, Duchess. So in the Looking Glass pub, well, I guess I should say why there are Wonderlandians just at these gateways, huh? So as in some iterations of Wonderland, there was a war. Back in my book, and this isn't necessarily spoilery because it's the backstory of the book, there was one queen, and she was queen of all of Wonderland, and she was, her name was Hortensia Harts, H-A-R-T-S, like stag, Harts. Queen of Hearts. You see, I play with the names just so that people can kind of guess that that's who it is, but then there are some characters where it's like, you wouldn't know unless you really read the book. So she was queen, and then she has 3 daughters. And the youngest one day, goes off to play with the first human that has ever crossed into Wonderland. It's a little blonde girl, blue dress, white apron, might know her. So the daughter plays with this playmate who comes through regularly. This child who is, because children can do that, who is such an imagination that she's managed to break through the veil for the first time from the human side. Never happened before. And one day both children go missing. They end up finding the young princess's body, the little blonde hair, blue dress, Mary Jane's, never find her. And the queen is so distraught because this child has clearly been killed by nightmares. She blames humanity. It's really easy to blame the rest of the world for problems that are in the world. But then there's a point where she's so consumed by grief, she decides that she wants to destroy humanity. They're the source, they gotta go. And you can't kill humanity without wiping out Wonderland. So the rest of Wonderland has a little bit of a problem with her plan, just a little bit. So the daughters take up arms against their mother to try and stop her because she's now started to actively call nightmares from the deep, dark heart of Wonderland to send to go, mess up humans. So you get sort of how I felt a little bit in being, well, I tried to I tried to bring some of the feeling that I had as a child being helpless, watching my parents go through what they went through. I was mad at the world and anybody who had anything to say about it. And I would lash out. So the queen, she's lashing out and her family is trying to stop her. And when they manage it, this is all before the book, so no spoilers. When they manage it, neither one of them wants to take on the mantle of ruling all of Wonderland because controlling that much power is how the queen was susceptible to these thoughts in the first place. The nightmares were able to start whispering to her because of her grief, because of her fear. Like people in Wonderland had never really had to deal with that. They're immortal. So unless they started fighting each other, which they hadn't had a reason to up until that point, there was no like loss. So grief enters the picture for the first time, for real, and a whole war starts. It's called the Cataclysm. And the end of it is one daughter goes off to rule one half, the other rules the other, and so you get the red and white queens. And the red queen is missing in my book. She's vanished after the war is done. And the white queen is off doing whatever queens do. I don't know, I am not one. I mean, I like to think I am, but not an actual responsibilities of the crown queen. And so Wonderland for the first time is broken. And I think that's kind of, at least in my reading of the original Alice in Wonderland, and then in the papers about the context of the time, because I like to read the book and learn about what was going on in the world when it was written. Otherwise, stuff gets lost, or we might think it means one thing when back then it meant another. The meaning of words change over time. And so Wonderland is broken because humanity is broken. And without getting into spoilery territory, that's what I'm wanting to do with this story as well, is to take kind of what he was trying to say about how, you know, society and the way that things are ordered and how these folks up top and these folks here, you know, it got lost to the degree that it's kind of seen as a fairy tale a little bit, which it is. But I wanted to sort of revisit not the darkness from Carroll's time, but the darkness from our time, so that readers today could connect to it. And hopefully, maybe want to go read the original. I mean, I leave a little hints there, like Alice has two cats, a Siamese cat named Lewis and a tabby named Carroll. So creative. But I really did hope to convey what I felt about Alice in Wonderland as a whole in this series and combine it with the things that I've dealt with in life and in searching for that rabbit hole, or in searching for a way to get lost, to just get away from this. But there is no running from it, is what I was trying to say with the book. Even though she could physically go somewhere else, the danger followed her there. The danger from this world followed her there. And now she has to deal with dangers from both worlds. And there's a quote, and I'll end with this in my ramblings. I will bore you no longer. There was a quote in the book where it talks about, she's thinking about how she lost her father and how that girl was killed. And so as a result, her mom is helicopter parenting. And it's really hard to be a monster slayer when your mother is calling you, wondering why you're not home for curfew. You can't really say, oh, I was out killing, you know, jaws that bite and claw that catch. But no. So she's going through all of this and she's thinking about how she's taking on defending the world. Because that's something, a weight that is put on Black women, is that there's this saying that went around the internet for a while, Black women will save us. We're in trouble. Can we, you know, not have to save the world? We're dealing with our own stuff here. Can we just be people like everybody else? So she's saving the world, and then she wonders who would ever take a moment to stop to save her. And that is a quote that has resonated with my readers. I did not expect it to. I was just putting what I felt into the story, sort of the same way I hope that Carroll was putting how he felt about the world into his story. And I hope he would be proud, is kind of the way that I feel about it. Not necessarily of me doing justice to his story, but me taking what he did and then running from it. And I hope that some writer somewhere reads mine and they take it somewhere else. And that's all I could ever hope from putting my favorite book into my circumstances in my life. And maybe, hey, just maybe somebody else might connect to it. I'm gonna stop talking. Any questions? about anything, about the book, about that aren't spoilery. I'll try not to be spoilery.
Forgive me if I didn't quite keep up,
Mhm.
but somewhere along the line, I was trying to figure out if the characters in your Wonderland are immortal,
Or what?
if they're immortal.
Yes, they are immortal.
Thank you.
Unless they are bodily killed, Highlander, they do not die. It requires, like, they don't get old and die because there's no sun in Wonderland, so there's no time. It's nonsense magic. So that's kind of how I'm able to get away with it a little bit.
So
is-
they don't age,
No.
but they can die.
Yes, if they are physically slain, but they will not die from natural causes.
Got it. And you use the term people, so you consider them people even though they had this magical status?
Yes, they are Wonderlandians. They are people. People in the term of, like, in Star Trek or Star Wars, they would say that, this is my people. They're from another planet, or they're from whatever, or they can do whatever. I kind of view them the same way because they can die. They do feel. They do have morals. They do have laws. They do have people who break those laws, but they don't deal with it the same way that we do. They've never had like an upheaval the way that we put ourselves through every 50 to 100 years. But they are immortal. So
Thanks. I thank you for the clarification. I got the bigger picture, but some of the nuances of how it got there were kind of
I was
getting.
trying not to ramble because I can do that very easily.
No, you did great. Thank you.
I think there's a chat question, but I don't want to touch anything.
We're on our way.
Okay.
It's the long distance commute right now.
Oh, I didn't even, okay.
Okay, the question in the chat is from Jan Suzina, and it is, why do you feel that many of the contemporary reimaginings of the Alice books, like your series and Tim Burton's Alice or the American McGee Alice, are so much more violent than Carroll's original texts?
I think it's because we're going based off of what we were given as opposed to him pulling it from wherever he got it. So when he comes up with the Jabberwocky and he makes the poem, snicker snack and with its head, he went galumphing back. So there's some violence, or you have the carpenter in the wall, it's like shucking these poor guys and devour, so there is some violence, but it's not towards people, I think. And with what I wanted to do with my book, I can't speak to Burton or anybody else, but for mine, I wanted to take the ability that Alice, the story, gave me to get away, but tie it to the things I was trying to get away from and see what came of that. That's why mine is more violent. And because the world is kind of violent towards me and people who look like me. That's just the way that it is, unfortunately. And you write what you know, and that is what I know.
I just wanted to sort of ask, you kind of started by talking about how the ideas came about for the book. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the writing process. Like, was it something that was, that just kind of came out of the imagination, or was there a lot of deliberation, especially because it deals with these themes that are so difficult for people who have experienced different types of traumas, and kind of sort of connected to that, how would you sort of, talk to someone else who might be interested in writing something creative in this manner, with also trying to balance those things of talking about those kind of issues that are so kind of important today?
I'm gonna say, as far as talking about the issues that are important today, that is a very personal journey. So I can kind of talk more to the writing process as opposed to how somebody might parse that, because the book was certainly, and I'm sure lots of writers will say the same thing, like in writing a book, you're processing whatever it is you're trying to put into the book, no matter what it is. And so I was trying to process a lot of, you know, what I had dealt with as a child and what I'm dealing with now, again, as an adult, and in trying to help her process it. So I can't really say this is, you know, ABCD, this is the process for it. But it is very personal. And to anybody wanting to put anything like that, I say go for it. The editing process is kind of where you'll smooth that out. You're allowed to be bumpy in the writing process. As far as with this, it kind of all spilled out of me over the course of maybe 7 to 8 months. I was going to school and working, you know, there were tiny people running around. And most of my focus went to picking the right elements from the Carroll work, because you can't just throw everything, because then it's just Alice in Wonderland that he wrote again, and that's plagiarism. And we were on a college campus, so no. So I know that there were staples, like you have to have the Mad Hatter, you have to have the Cheshire Cat, you know, you have to have somebody to stand in for Alice. I named mine Alice, short for Allison. Her whole name is Allison Kingston, but they call her Alice. So most of my work and focus went into finding the threads that I could pull from his and sort of like attach to mine, so that there was a through line for people, not only who had read it, but if you hadn't read it, you wouldn't get lost, or you wouldn't be confused by something that I put in there. So it's very, I would say that it's maybe 70% surface level Alice in Wonderland, and then there's nuggets for like the good folks here in the society. Like if you know your Alice in Wonderland, you're gonna pick up on this stuff. So that's where most of my writing process went to. I didn't plot any of it. Like I said, I sat down and I I wrote a fight scene. I liked it. Turns out I'm pretty good at fight scenes. Who'd have thought? And so I just kept going. I ended up throwing a lot of it out because it wasn't needed for the book, but I needed it for the writer and for trying to get close to how I felt reading Carroll's work, and connected that to how somebody today might feel trying to read it, maybe not being able to, you know, get it, or somebody who likes it, but still might want a little bit of a modern take. I mean, there's nothing wrong with liking the original and wanting, oh, well, it would have been nice if this happened, you know? So I'm of the mind of, I want all the Alice in Wonderland things. There could be 100 versions, and I'm gonna lap them all up and we'll sort it out afterwards. Did that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions while I'm up here getting tired of the sound of my own voice?
I think you may have already said this, but when was your book published and who is your target audience? What age group?
The first book came out in 2018. It is a young adult. So the target audience is 14 to 18, but I am not 14 to 18. So I wrote it also for people who just like Alice in Wonderland, or maybe like Alice and Buffy the Vampire, who maybe also like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So my target audience is, and if I had to say that who I wrote the book for, it would be other Black kids who didn't see themselves in these stories or on these covers. There's a study done every year for YA. I don't know the adult markets, but for picture books, chapter books, like from ABC 1, 2, 3, See Jack Run, all the way up to like Twilight, about 5,000 to 6,000 children's books get published a year. And 600 of them are about Black people. 300 are by Black people. That's somewhere around 6%. So I grew up loving a genre that didn't necessarily love me back. And my sisters started having kids and they started getting into comics and stuff and asking Auntie Tracy about all these questions and wanting to watch the movies that I'm watching. So I said, there will be at least one story for them. So it's for everybody who can read it. I like to take the Lemonade approach. Like Beyonce's Lemonade is a love letter to a particular demographic, but everybody can enjoy it and read it. Nobody's kicked out. The second one came out in 2019. The third one, I'm currently copy editing. It was supposed to come out in 2020, but the panini happened, so the pandemic. I will reference the pandemic in different P words without saying, so just so you're not confused, I will say parallelogram sometimes, parentheses. But yeah, that was my target audience is kids 14 to 18, but I wrote it specifically for little me and the other people like little me who couldn't find themselves in a section of books that they loved.
Thank you.
It can be questions about publishing or about the books. Because I'm hoping that I was clear about why I wrote them and my connection to it, but it makes sense in my head sometimes more than it does when it comes out.
I think it made a lot of sense. I'm gonna say, and I think everyone enjoyed hearing it. I also think we've been caroling for about 12 hours now, so everyone's winding down. But thank you so much.
Thank you.